reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent.
Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you. Hop on in here. Let's talk about, what should we talk about this week? I kind of feel like we should talk about flowers. We talk about flowers and bees. We'll talk about climate change. No, let's talk about gender diversity. Let's talk about gender diversity. And this week, oh goodness, it's only been a couple of weeks, hasn't it? I miss you, and it has been a couple of weeks, maybe the most monumental couple of weeks I have ever seen for the trans community, certainly in a generation in the UK, has blown my mind. I actually find myself quite speechless, and for all my trans and gender diverse kin out there in the UK, you may well be sitting there feeling absolutely god-awful right now with what has happened in the Supreme Court and what the UK government has done with the ruling in the Supreme Court. But just know that I do too. And you know, this is a horrible thing, and all my trans friends I've been messaging, and one friend who is going to move to Nova Scotia, which I think is a completely rational thing to do. Right now, like, hey, if we get a flat with 2 rooms, maybe we can move together. But then I have other friends who've been messaging me saying they feel like they're oscillating between defiance and terror, which I think is pretty accurate. That's pretty much where I am. So yeah, don't worry, I'm fine. I'm fine, y'all. I'm fine. But the community is not okay right now. And I got to say, I'm not super okay either. I feel like I've got so much adrenaline in my body that working out is the only thing that currently makes sense. We'll get to the Supreme Court's ruling in a minute, but the news has been so extensive. There's been so much going on in the States and in the UK. Trump established April as a month that is dedicated to, at least in part, fighting the evil and backwards lie of gender insanity, which is, great. The Trump White House has directed the National Institute of Health, the NIH, to study regret after transgender people transition. After cancelling nearly all NIH projects studying transgender health, they decided to instruct the US Biomedical Agency to study just the negative consequences of transitioning, please. Sure, that's not how science works, but great. There's been a great study by Cahill and colleagues looking at the role of gender congruence and affirming care in the lives of trans men in particular, on their body image and quality of life. Super important piece of work that, we're just going to have to skip over because we've got so much else going on. But they found that gender congruence and the affirmative care that provides gender congruence improves bodily satisfaction and quality of life across psychological, physiological, and environmental domains, although not social quality of life. Not super surprising. I know we're going fast. I know we have to go fast. There's so much news in Florida. Marcy Rankin, this absolute hero, brave 20-year-old college student, wrote to Florida's to every Florida state lawmaker to inform them that she planned to use a restroom at the state house that corresponded with their gender identity, which is now remarkably unlawful in Florida. She included a photo of herself for identification. Incredible. The Tampa Bay Times reported that this is what she said in her letter. So cool. She said, "I know that in your heart this law is wrong and unjust. I know that you know in your heart that transgender people are human too, and that you can't arrest us away." She wrote, "I know that you know I have dignity, and that's why I know you won't arrest me." She went into the bathroom, washed her hands, and they arrested her immediately afterwards. She now amazingly faces a misdemeanor trespassing charge, which is incredible, punishable by up to 60 days in jail. She's due to appear in court in May. A brave transgender woman. We can only hope. Like, I'm 42. I would be like, I'd be hesitant to do something like that. But maybe I'm inspired by her to get my ass arrested. Let's see. Amazing. And then in the UK, the Supreme Court on Wednesday of last week ruled that when reviewing the Equality Act specifically, that the Equality Act, when it refers to sex, refers to biological sex. Do they define what biological sex is, given that biological sex doesn't really function like a binary when you get down to the real weeds of it? No, they don't. They do not. Which means that biological sex is kind of, the only certified biological sex that we have, right? The only evidence that any of us has of our biological sex is our birth certificate. But of course, transgender people can change their birth certificates with a gender recognition certificate. So, there's now no way for anybody to demonstrate their biological sex at birth. Like, there's no way to do that. So the Supreme Court's just like, it'll be fine. Yeah, it'll be fine. The Supreme Court ruling is itself obviously pretty horrendous for the trans community. And honestly, you may not know this, but historically, the trans community has kind of relied on the judiciary, because the judiciary have always been quite supportive of the trans community and quite protective of our rights. So even when, even the original Gender Recognition Act, it's sometimes easy to be like, oh, wow, the UK government was so good to introduce the Gender Recognition Act and give transgender people legal recognition. They were forced to do that by the European Court of Human Rights, losing cases like Goodwin versus United Kingdom and I versus United Kingdom that highlighted the UK's failure to legally recognise transgender people in the gender with which they identify. They were found to be violating transgender people's human rights, and therefore were kind of forced to establish the Gender Recognition Act. So the UK government has never been the friend of transgender people ever across the world, but particularly here at home, absolutely never been the friend of transgender people. And the Gender Recognition Act forced upon them, really. And now, ever since every challenge, the judiciary has always been the sort of the body, the power that holds our rights and makes sure that we don't lose them. And then the Supreme Court just doesn't uphold them. And it's a pretty damning indictment of the current social situation that no trans organization tried to intervene in the court case. Like, they can formally intervene and try to give evidence and petition to give evidence, essentially, but there were no trans organizations that did that. Why? Most likely because they would have been hauled over the coals publicly and, often being almost obliterated out of existence. And so no trans organization felt empowered to do so. And so the Supreme Court heard no trans organizations, no transgender people in the whole of the case. They heard a lot of anti-trans organizations. And then their ruling was pretty negative. Ultimately, they ruled that the Equality Act, bearing in mind, right, that the Gender Recognition Act says in it that transgender people are considered the gender with which they identify, for which they have a gender recognition certificate in all areas, right? In all areas of life. And then the Supreme Court said, not the Equality Act. And that overnight had earth-rending effects for my community, for our community. It just absolutely tore up our rights overnight. Now, the act itself and the sort of interpretation of the act by the Supreme Court does not actually do that, right? It doesn't change anything overnight. It just kind of says that, the only thing I can see that it actually changes is that trans people, trans women in particular, can't sue for equal pay, right? So say I'm at work and I'm not paid as well as men around me. Historically, I'd be able to say, hey, I'm a woman and these guys are paid more than me. Is that not sex discrimination? Surely I should be allowed to get equal work for equal pay for equal work. And they were like, and that would, the Equality Act was the law that gave me the opportunity to do that, to take people to court, to force people to pay me fairly. And now with this change, I can't do that. Like, trans women can't do that anymore. Trans men now can, which is ridiculous. Trans men can be considered women under the Equality Act, which is obviously ridiculous, right? And yet, nobody heard, let's not get into it, but that in and of itself is pretty bad, but it doesn't really change anything overnight otherwise. But the EHRC, the Equality Human Rights Commission in the UK, our equal rights watchdog, is headed by Kishwa Faulkner, who has never been a particular fan of transgender people, forgive me. At least the statements she has made have been pretty anti-trans in my book. Hey Kishwa, if I'm wrong about that, please get in touch, get in the comments, let me know, or get in touch, let me know that you are going to support trans people to access the spaces that are right for them. I'm all for it, but it seems you're not, because you have said already said that the HRC are going to be writing a statutory code of practice and sending it to Parliament by the summer, which bans transgender women from women's spaces, from women's sports, from changing rooms, and from toilets, which is the kind of thing that is a dystopian nightmare for the trans community, and that you're going to put, the government is going to put pressure on the NHS to ban transgender people from the wards that are appropriate for their gender. Now, that's messed up, right? Like, I don't want to be placed in a men's ward when I go into, bearing in mind that, like, it shouldn't matter, but like, I have a girl body as much as anybody else does, right? It put me on a male ward. That feels like a terrible thing to do. But more than that, it instantly outs me to everyone around. It outs me and puts me in danger as a consequence. And so does, the toilet ban. If I decide to, if I have to use the disabled loo, I mean, I use that fairly often anyway. I'm a wheelchair user, but like, if I'm not always in my wheelchair, like if I am walking around and I use the disabled loo because I can't use the female loo because you've banned me from it, then everybody around is going to be like, oh, hey, that girl's pretty tall, actually, or she's got quite big feet, is that an Adam's apple? Like, and people are going to look and be like, oh, that's a trans person, right? Whereas 5 minutes ago, I could have managed to survive in this world, and now suddenly I find myself in danger everywhere I go, right? And that's the case for every transgender person. Every gender diverse person in the UK right now is not sure what the hell is about to happen. But we were waiting for the UK government to say some stuff, and then they said some stuff which was really bad. So let's hear what the UK government had to say. So this is the Minister for Women and Equalities of the United Kingdom, Bridget Phillipson.
What about questions that come up quite regularly, but are important basic questions? Now we've had that ruling. If a trans woman is out in public today and wants to use the toilet, which toilet should they use?
That should be on the basis of biological sex. That would apply right across the board to all single-sex provision. But the EHRC will be setting out additional guidance and a statutory code of practice, because we need to make sure that everyone has the ability to access services that are safe and appropriate and respect their privacy and dignity. So the Supreme Court was clear about the importance of women's, biological women, having access to those spaces. But of course, where it comes to provisions such as changing facilities, hospital facilities and others, there needs to be appropriate and available services there for all people, including trans people. And that's why the guidance and the code of practice that the EHRC will set out will be important in this area, and we hope that they can do so as quickly as possible.
And just for clarity, because it is an important point, and as you say, that guidance is being rushed through, but it's not here yet. If you are a trans woman and you're out in public, you need to use the toilet today, it is the men's toilet that you use.
The ruling was clear that provision and services should be accessed on the basis of biological sex. But I know that many businesses, large and small, will ensure that they have appropriate provision in place. For example, many businesses have moved towards unisex provision or separate cubicles that can be used by anyone, where you would not be sharing those. Well, that is already the position in most cases. But as I say, the ruling from the Supreme Court was clear that access to provision should be on the basis of biological sex.
But just what if, and again, I realise that this is a topic that's been talked about, it's a question that's been asked, but it is important. If that third space doesn't exist yet, if there isn't anything other than a male and a female toilet, and you are a trans woman who wants to use the toilet today, which door do you walk through?
You use the service that's available on the basis of biological sex. I appreciate the point that you're asking around third spaces or unisex spaces. In many cases, those do already exist, including in small businesses.
They don't.
They do.
Places.
Go into your local cafe, a local family cafe. Chances are you'll have one cubicle that's self-contained that can be used by anyone with a wash basin
toilet.
inside of it. No. In many cases, just this one toilet that's to be used by everyone.
Thanks very much to Bridget Phillipson for such an interesting question posed as the half an hour in the form of confident declaration. Cora's done, Bridget. I'm done. Listen, Bridget, I don't understand how you're going to implement this policy. For two reasons. One, because there is no way for people to prove their biological sex. I don't know how anybody is supposed to do that. They can carry around their birth certificates, but of course transgender people with a gender recognition certificate have changed their birth certificate, so I don't know. Even if we consider that what you are trying to do makes sense, I don't know how you do it. Like, I don't know how you ever find all the trans people. You can't. Two, Bridget, trans people have, our vigilance against cis normativity, our vigilance against being seen, our vigilance about hiding in plain sight is our resting state, Bridget, at least for many of us. For me, Bridget, hiding in plain sight is my resting state. The vigilance that comes from being a marginalized person in this world, when you watch with eagle eyes the people around you as they notice you, as they laugh in your vicinity, as they give a lingering glance in your direction, as they double take as you pass. We know what it is to be vigilant to those experiences, and we know how to stay safe. For me, I hide in plain sight. I work on my voice, Bridget. Like, I have done voice training again, 10 years into transition. I do voice training again because it's the only way for me to stay safe is to stay secret in your world. And so, Bridget, what's going to happen is that people are not going to see me when they come looking for trans people, right? When the guards at the door, you're going to put guards at every door? Clearly not. You're going to rely on vigilante justice to police this. And if that happens, the people who are going to get caught by vigilante justice, the people who are going to be accused of being transgender, are not transgender people in the main, in part because we're so damn good at hiding in plain sight, because we know how important it is to stay vigilant to the threats in our environment, and we know how to stay safe in their context. But not that. It's because we're such a tiny community, 0.5% of the population. So you're going to find that the people that are going to get targeted by these vigilantes are cisgender women who don't conform to standards of femininity. They're going to be the women who are more masculine, who are more muscular, who have shorter hair, a deeper voices. They're not transgender women. They're going to be cisgender women. Is this feminism, Bridget? Is this what feminism fought for women, like transgender women and cisgender women, to be discriminated against if they don't conform to typical standards of femininity? Is that what we fought for? Is that what we want? You're going to ban trans women, but it's going to be cisgender women who are going to be the people who suffer, because they're going to be the people who targeted. Of course, it is also going to be transgender women who are actively targeted, whose lives are going to be made worse, who are going to be in more danger, Bridget, than we were yesterday. You are the Labour government. You were supposed to be our people. You were supposed to look after us. You were supposed to keep us safe, and you are there actively taking away our rights. What has happened to you? What has happened to us as a country that we are just willing to throw transgender people to the wolves to maintain some cis-normative standard of femininity? Is that really who we are now, Bridget? Is it? Keir Starmer yesterday said he does no longer think that transgender women are women. And it makes me sad. I'll be straight with you. For several days after the Supreme Court ruling, was just adrenaline, nothing but adrenaline. I would work out multiple times a day because it's the only thing that made sense to my body my body only felt okay when I was working out. The rest of the time I felt like I needed to lift a Ford Fiesta. I was just so much adrenaline. And then I went to go and see my sister-in-law, and on the way we stopped in at my brother's and we had to go drop something off, and I asked him for a hug and he gave me a hug, and I just burst into tears on his shoulder. Bridget, I just burst into tears on his shoulder. Is that what we have become? A woman who has been out for 12 years, who is, ostensibly successful in this world, who has a freaking podcast, who publishes science. We published in the biggest journal in this field in the world, Bridget. And I just burst into tears. Is that where we are? I think that is where we are. So that's where we are. I don't know what else to say. I can't really put it into words, but I do know someone who can put it into words. Carla Antonelli, who is an absolute legend in the Spanish Parliament, the first trans senator, and she spoke in Spanish Parliament very recently with a speech which I cannot emulate. Of course, it is in Spanish, so I will translate. But here is the absolutely legendary Spain's first trans senator, Carla Antonelli. Trans people, we are everyone's topic of conversation. Everyone has to have an opinion about us. If we are trans, what we are, what we are not. Maria Belén, do we have orgasms or not? Are we happy or not? Do we get surgery or not? Do we mutilate ourselves or not? Leave us alone, for God's sake, since you claim to believe in God so much. Members of Vox, today you came here to derogate us, to derogate my colleague Jimena, to derogate me. Honestly, don't you feel ashamed? Do you not feel any shame at all for trying to erase, to cut out of this country a historically persecuted group of people? People who are finally starting to lift our heads, trying to find our place in this world. You are making our lives absolutely unbearable. And, Mr. Fuster, I was a child too, okay? I'm 65 years old now, and yet you act as if we just appeared out of nowhere. The truth is, I went through exactly what you want parents of trans kids to do today. Trying to stop me from living my life the way I really want to live my life. Dragging me to psychiatrists, being abandoned, cast aside by my own family. My father dying and no one even calling me to his damn funeral. That is what you want, to push us back to the margins. But let me be clear, we will not go back to the margins. We will not go back to the margins. Oh, an absolute hero. An absolute hero. We will not go back to the margins. We will not go back to the margins. I don't know what to say. I have a podcast and I'm speechless. What a bad combination. But let's do what we do here. What do we do here? We take confident statements from public figures, sometimes, politicians, sometimes the Labour government. Keir Starmer no longer believed to be left-wing, regardless of how he identifies, but still the Labour government. And sometimes a caller into an LBC show, as today. We're going to take an LBC caller as our prompt for today, and what she says is really, really interesting to me. I've heard it a few times, and I think she articulates it kind of beautifully. And I think it is a really good prompt for today in the context of the Supreme Court ruling, in the context of Bridget Phillips, in the context of Keir Starmer's statement. So here is our LBC caller.
Final question. Why do you think the judge urged people not to see it as a triumph?
Well, I mean, I understand that trans women who, actually pass for women, a lot of their, I mean, it is sad from their perspective. I mean, I do feel sad for them.
Okay.
Because I understand their point, but I think they should be allowed in if they've had, the operations and everything.
Which brings us back to the question of how you'd check.
Thanks so very much to this unnamed LBC caller for such an interesting question posed, as they often aren't, honestly, in the form of kind of cautious inquisition. And hey, we'll take it for the question we're sure that it was intended to be. We'll see if we can't find an answer. It's interesting, the distinction between passing and not passing as being some benchmark for entry to spaces, right? That trans women who do pass for women, she says, should be allowed to access those spaces. She does feel bad for us, for them. And so we're going to talk about passing. Let's talk about passing. Why don't we have passing as the kind of benchmark for entry to women's spaces, right? Which it currently is about to become, I think, as we got vigilantes charging into doors of toilet rooms wherever they see somebody who doesn't pass, would be my guess is what's going to happen. And there are some incredibly interesting articles on this topic. Now, the big one, if you are looking for a kind of primer on passing and the challenges of talking about passing, because we are going to talk about it, we are going to use the language of passing, but we are going to talk about some of the challenges of that language. Goats and colleagues in 2022, and colleagues, just goats in 2022. Self-recognition, authenticity passing, and trans-embodied imaginaries in studies in gender and sexuality. Very cool primer. Really reviews the history of passing, where it came from, and some of the challenges. And they talk about how we shouldn't talk about passing. They talk about how we should talk about legibility instead, because they talk about passing as having two major problems. Now, we'll talk about what those problems are. But let's review exactly what passing is. We're going to come back to goats in a moment. For the trans community, the concept of passing is a way to describe transgender people who show no clear signs of the gender they were assigned at birth, right? So people who pass, in inverted commas, pass for the gender that they identify as. So I'm going to try not to talk about other trans people too much here, because talking for other people is going to be a bit challenging here. I know that, for example, passing is very different for non-binary communities, who obviously in a binary world that tends to read people as male or female. Sometimes some of the research I've been reading talks about non-binary communities feeling like they pass, in inverted commas, by challenging those norms and by not being able to be read very easily as either male or female. That's kind of affirming and is a kind of opportunity to sort of discard the concept of passing entirely, right? And that the act of thwarting passing is sort of an act of affirmation and defiance and resilience. Very cool. So I'm going to try not to speak to experiences that I don't fully understand or don't share, but I will talk to my own, right? Which we do here. Cora talks her own experience enough. And so for me, passing has become, like, when I first transitioned, right? I first transitioned when I was doing my doctorate in educational psychology. I went in year 2, full girl mode right at the start of year 2, and I for the first time I had meetings with people, and we decided that I needed to, like, the conversations that I was having in my year 2 placement were that the problem wasn't that I was trans. The problem would be that I was gender non-conforming and trans, right? That if I had a boy voice and a boy name, that would be problematic. I'm working in schools, I'm working with kids it is a possibility that people might feel, like parents in particular might feel, especially if they don't like transgender people particularly, that might be problematic, right? So I sort of understood it. And at the same time, I was going to the gender clinic in London, and my first psychiatrist said to me around the same time, listen, if you're not willing to be a woman in all areas of your life, I realize I dipped my voice for woman right there. A woman. If you're not willing to be a woman in all areas of your life, then I'm not sure that we can help you, was his phrase. And I was like, what does that even mean, So I have to be a woman in inverted commas, like I have to perform femininity to a way that he thinks it, to his standards, a dude, yes, unbelievable. To his standards, I have to perform femininity. Gosh, I got too much adrenaline. To his standards, I have to perform femininity. So I have to meet his standards in all areas of my life, or he won't help me. And I have to perform femininity in my workplace because I need to, in inverted commas, pass as cisgender as best I can to avoid discrimination. So I did, I learned how to be a girl in the world in all ways and means, regardless of where my actual gender lay. If it was in a sort of more non-binary space, which I think it was early in my transition, and it got to a more sort of binary feminine space. But I had to do some of that because that's the only way that I could live in the world, frankly. So passing became the only way for me to survive, because when I was out on placement, when I was in schools, when I was working with parents, the only way that I could do that was to not let anyone know I was trans, right? It was literally the only way to survive, because I couldn't anticipate whether people would be welcoming. And like the vast majority of people were welcoming, of course. I was a good EP. I joke about being a bad EP, but I promise you, I was pretty good as an EP. I'm a scientist now, full time pretty much. But when I was working as an EP, I like to think that I did an okay job, right? And it had nothing to do with my gender, right? My gender was irrelevant to how good I was as an EP. Totally, fundamentally, fully irrelevant. It just was about my embodiment in the world. And it really didn't matter. It shouldn't matter to anybody else. But me being trans might have mattered to people. So me passing became a way of staying safe. Now, I want to also say that I also came out to basically every school I ever worked with because I wanted people to know I was trans. I didn't come out to every parent I worked with because it's not relevant, but I definitely came out to my schools because I don't want to have the anxiety of, is this person going to find out, right? And I didn't realize then, so passing, right, became really critical, but also coming out became really critical. And I reached this really sweet spot where I came out to the people who I was working with more, like to parents, not to parents, but to staff who I had long-term relationships with, schools I had long-term relationships with. I would absolutely tell them I was trans at some point, right? And honestly, fairly early in our relationship. But to parents, I wouldn't. And passing, just being a girl in the world with parents was like beautiful, and just I got to be an EP in the world, just do my goddamn job, and trans not be something that was relevant in the room for 5 minutes. Incredible. And I have that experience now too. Like, I meet lots of people and I make friends with people, and there are friends I have in my life who I don't tell that I'm trans, right? There are friends I have who I consider to be, pretty good friends, and I don't tell them that I'm trans because just it's not relevant. I'm just me in the world. That is the truth of me, right? Now, this is the reason why Goetz describes, the first reason why Goetz describes passing as problematic, because passing implies, now other people have said this too, Hussein in 2024, Hijra, Trans and the Grids of Passing in Sexuality is really interesting. Passing reinforces this kind of notion that being in the world embodied as our authentic selves is an act of deception in some way, right? Because you pass for something you are not, right? you pass for cis, which you're not. I mean, that's why I think passing is okay, because I think it can be misunderstood, or at least it can be understood in some circles, that you're passing for a woman, but you're not passing for a woman, you're passing for cisgender, and you're not cisgender, though you are a woman. So I do understand that, it can be confused. If you think of passing as passing for a woman, as that caller did, LBC caller, thanks so much, if you pass for a woman, then, you deserve to be in women's spaces. That's problematic, because as Hussein and Goetz describe, it's not good to think of passing as an act of deception, right? That people passing for the gender that they are doesn't really make sense. Passing for cisgender does, because we aren't cisgender, right? Nobody thinks that we are, but we are women. Now, the other way of thinking about this, which is cool, is Goetz describes legibility as an alternative, right? So, are you able to be correctly read as the gender that you identify as, right? Are you in your daily life correctly read? And that they describe as legibility rather than passing. Really important. Now, the other reason that Goetz has a problem with passing is because of its history. Now, passing as a term wasn't used originally by the trans community. It was used by people of color, particularly in the States, and particularly people of color who described passing as the ability or the feature that they had of passing in daily life as white, offering the opportunity to avoid white supremacist discrimination, dehumanization, and violence that white individuals often enacted on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? Of course, that passing also came at a great emotional cost, forsaking one's family, ancestry, and culture, and left them at great physical risk of being discovered as, in inverted commas, a supposed racial imposter, right? So the concept of passing wasn't really, it was sort of adopted by the trans community because it fits our experience so well, but it wasn't, its origins were from people of color describing the ability to kind of escape racism and white supremacist discrimination at the cost of forsaking family, ancestry, and culture, and at the cost of extreme risk, right, of being discovered. So that does have parallels with the trans experience, right? So the adopted language actually does make sense. So for trans women, passing as cisgender does allow me to use the toilet without getting accosted. It allows me to, use the changing room at the gym without being accosted. Even though I'm always going to use a freaking cubicle, and I'll use the disabled toilet as much as I possibly can, because I don't want to have to manage the danger of somebody speaking to me in the toilet and then me having to say hi and maybe giving myself away, in inverted commas, not giving myself away. That's the wrong term, right? That's Goetz's criticism of passing as a concept. When I speak in the toilet, the risk isn't that I give myself away, in inverted commas, right? It isn't that I betray the fact that I'm a man under the surface, like Cuttlefish Barbie, but rather that my voice will make them think that I'm not a girl at all, which is incorrect, because I very much am. Listen, I don't know if you know this, but I am a girl. I absolutely am. So when they hear my voice and they kind of give me that kind of quizzical look, the risk is that I'll get discriminated against. The risk is that they'll see me as not the girl that I am. So I want you, that's why we're going to labor this point heavily, I'm sure. But the concept of passing, referring to kind of trans individuals, it should be thought of as being legibility. That passing is about being correctly legible. It's not saying that to pass is to be read as something that someone is not, which is the risk. Okay. So Goetz has this actually really kind of cool point where she refers to the Empire Strikes Back manifesto from Sandy Stone, published in 1994. And Sandy Stone refers to passing as invisibility as an imperfect solution to personal dissonance. But what Goetz describes is that external legibility for trans persons is an imperfect solution for societal dissonance. That is the anxiety society experiences when unable to decide boy or girl. The misrecognition, the inability to recognize at all, is painful when it destroys the illusion that we embody an internal truth in a specific and externally legible manner. It is painful because our existence in the world is based on our ability to be legible to it. And when people misgender us or they can't recognize us at all, the pain is from the destruction of that illusion that maybe we can just be in the world legibly. Now, it might not be an illusion for many. Now, in Goetz's work, 8 of the 18 individuals they interviewed described a desire to pass as they moved through the world outside of the gender binary. Now, for them, they talked about passing as being meant being misgendered in a way that felt less hurtful. For example, like extending beyond the binary, being unable to be recognized, being unable to be categorized as male or female. And for some, like the least painful assumption that people could make was to categorize them as the gender with which they were not assigned at birth. But for others, just confusing people in terms of your gender, having them engage in that discomfort was the most affirming act that they could experience in terms of passing and legibility. Very cool. Now, passing, it turns out, is also quite important because it keeps people safe, right? Peixoto and colleagues in 2022, Interpersonal Violence and Passing, results from a Brazilian trans-Pacific cross-sectional study, Journal of Interpersonal Violence, incredible study, really interesting. They brought together 121 trans women, median age of 36.3, 78.5% were black or mixed race, and they asked them about their experiences of passing and discrimination, and they found some very interesting things. They found that people who passed frequently had a greater rate of family violence, but lower rates of observed police violence and violence in open and closed public spaces. They found that passing very frequently reduced 81%, by 81%, the chance of suffering violence in open public spaces more than once in a lifetime. Now, given that the rates of homicide for transgender people around the world are the highest for people of color, for trans women of color in particular, it is an important study that highlights how valuable passing can be to staying safe in dangerous environments. Next up, Baumier and colleagues, why do I always say and colleagues? Just Baumier, sorry Baumier, 2025, Negotiating Trans Identity and Boundaries at Work, How Situation and Personal Factors Affect Workplace Identity Communication in the Western Journal of Communication. Brought together about 200 participants, 76.2% were white, 16 participants were black or African American, 14 identified as Asian, 5 identified as Native American, and 1 identified as Native Hawaiian. This is quite a modern study, and it kind of extends the concept of passing, basically. So they talk about that people who make efforts to pass and who are able to pass, bearing in mind that it's often a sort of privilege without, it's either a privilege because you are able to access the services and support and in some cases surgery that allows you to pass, and in some cases you're just fortunate in that you do by some fluke of genetics. But either way, it's kind of an unearned, to some extent, kind of privilege that's not afforded to everyone. So you have to absolutely keep that in mind. But they talk about how passing can be valuable because it keeps people safe. But it also, they talk about covering as a part of kind of like closely related to passing, but that covering is about not talking about trans identity in the workplace and distancing yourself from your identity, from your trans identity. And that's the act of covering. So what they suggest is that people who can pass and cover in order to protect themselves in their workplace, such that when people view passing as important to them, they are less likely to speak openly about their trans identity and to signal that identity otherwise, like through transcoded artifacts like a pride flag, for example. So it's really interesting, right? They talk about that being like problematic in a way, like it's a way for people to stay safe, effectively passing, feeling like you effectively pass, not disclosing your identity, like allows you to stay safe in the world, but that ultimately it prevents you from engaging with your identity and makes it difficult to advocate for yourself in the workplace in a way that's crucial to your identity, right? Like you can't advocate for yourself or for other people if you are passing and covering in the workplace. Really tricky. But they do say that for many people, passing is the only way. Like it's not just a desire, but it can also be a need to be perceived in a certain way because it keeps trans folk safe and keeps them from experiencing the discrimination that comes from revealing your trans identity. Now, to punctuate this point about safety, Begun and Katari 2016, Conforming for Survival, Associations between Transgender Visual Conformity or Passing and Homelessness Experiences in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Social Services, the Quarterly Journal of Community and Clinical Practice. Really interesting piece of work. They brought together a huge number, like 6,456 transgender or gender non-conforming people, about 40% of whom identified as women, and about 26% of whom identified as men, 19% identified as living part-time in their authentic gender, 13% identified with the term not listed, and talked about gender identities sort of beyond the binary. 75% of the participant pool were white, 24% identified as people of color. A large age range, 18 to 98, was captured in the sample, mean age of just below 37. Fascinating study. So this is from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey covering all 50 states in the US. And it's super interesting. So what they found essentially was that people who were assigned male at birth were significantly more likely to have ever been homeless due to their transgender or gender non-conforming identity compared to those who were assigned female at birth. They found that people who identify today primarily as living part-time in their authentic gender were less likely than individuals who identify today as primarily as female to have ever experienced homelessness. So people who identify as female, who are assigned male at birth, who live full-time as female, more likely to experience homelessness or have experienced homelessness. And younger participants were more likely to experience homelessness. And of course, compared to white counterparts, people who are identified as Black or African American, American Indian or Alaskan Native, biracial or multiracial were all more likely to have experienced homelessness than their white counterparts. The only group that was less likely to experience homelessness than white counterparts were Asian or Pacific Islander identifying participants. But interestingly, right, people who identified as more visually conforming, who were more able to pass, were significantly less likely to have ever experienced homelessness due to their transgender or gender non-conforming identity. So passing protects against homelessness in the United States. Remarkable, right? Because the ability to pass for cisgender is a way of staying safe in modern society. Incredible. So as we kind of narrow in on an answer to this question from our question asker from LBC, the caller, yeah, listen, I kind of understand. I understand the question. But I think the question implies that passing is something that all trans people should do, and passing is something that we have choice and control over. But I need you to know we don't have control over it. When I first started transition, I was sure that I would always be read as a guy for the rest of my life. A guy in women's clothes. That was absolutely what I thought was going to happen. And I was willing to do that, to try and live authentically in this world. And the fact that people see me as a girl now, the fact that I get legibilized, I get read correctly, appropriately, is a dream come true for me. But I would have done this regardless. Even if the world wouldn't see me as a girl, I would have done this regardless. I would have tried to be one. I would have been one. And I want you to understand that inside, in me, I would have been one anyway. I would always have been one. And so, you know, passing is not a choice. It's something that the community has to do to stay safe. It's how we stave off violence and discrimination. It's how we get by in the workplace. It's how we prevent violence, even in the most violent contexts. The world that we are in is one where we are always at risk. Always at risk. And passing, in inverted commas, being legible, has become, I don't know, the way that many of us stay safe in the world, at least those of us who want to and those of us who can. It's how we stay safe in the world. So for you to say, you're passing trans women, of course, I feel sorry for them. It's not them who are the problem. I think you misunderstand what it is to be trans in this world. We are not the problem. And we are not the reason that we must pass. You are. The world of gender normativity that says there are only two genders in this world, male and female, and which one you are assigned at birth is the one that you will always be. Those are the rules that you created. They're not our rules. We wouldn't have built a system like this. We know gender is different to that. We know sex is different to that. It's not the world that we would create for ourselves, but we understand that it is the world that we must, at least to some extent, conform to survive. And so for me personally, I conform to it. I'm doing voice training right now. Do I feel like I want to do voice training for me? No. Why do I do voice training? Because when someone speaks to me in the toilet, I need to hide in plain sight so that I don't get assaulted. That's the reason. Now I want to leave you with a very cool study. Pfeiffer, and and colleagues again. No, not and colleagues. Pfeiffer, just Pfeiffer. 2014. I don't like passing as a straight woman. Queer negotiations of identity and social group membership in the African Journal of Sociology. Is kind of it's quite a personal account. It's quite a beautifully written personal account of their own experience, and she's a lesbian woman married to a trans man, and it's kind of amazing. It's all about kind of how she renegotiates her own identity as she enters into an ostensibly kind of cisgender like heterosexual relationship, and about kind of navigating the world as a queer woman who gets read as straight because of the relationship that she's in, which is kind of wild, and how her partner kind of wanted to, enjoyed passing as a straight couple, but she, as a queer woman, doesn't want to be read as straight because she's queer. It's kind of awesome, really interesting, well worth a read. But she writes this, and I think this is a really important passage. A direct quote from her talking about her trans male partner really interesting, and I think is going to sort of crystallize the problem that we now face in the UK with transgender people being barred from the toilets. Trans women barred from women's toilets, potentially right on the horizon. Trans men being barred from men's toilets, right on the horizon. I think this is the problem that we're going to face. He almost got beat up that night. He went to the women's restroom because he wasn't fully male and he didn't want gay guys to find out that he didn't have a penis. So he chose to use the women's restroom that night. He was still fairly early into his transition, and a guy followed him in there and watched him urinate and said, "Take off that binder. I don't know why you want to be a guy." Later, the guy lunged across the dance floor at him, and luckily, one of our friends pushed him out of the way. I don't think this is the world that we want. We've already done an episode, if you're interested, we've done an episode on transgender women in particular, being in the toilet. Does not, like, trans-inclusive policies do not increase the risk to cisgender women from transgender women or from cisgender men in those spaces. And importantly, trans inclusion decreases the risk to trans people using those spaces because they are using the spaces that are appropriate to them. And to Bridget Phillipson, to Keir Starmer, to the UK government, to the EHRC, to the Supreme Court, I am going to say this. You are welcome to ban us from the toilets. You are welcome to do whatever it is that you have coming for my community. But you need to know that we're going to be using those spaces regardless. You know why? Because we are here and we will not go back to the margins. Because we are going to create a world for all gender diverse people, and especially for gender diverse young people to know that they will always have a place in this world to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You are always welcome here, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.